Good afternoon, everyone. This is Kari Arfstrom, and I'm the Deputy Executive Director here at NAST, and I'd like to welcome everyone to today's webinar. Assisting me today is Emma Heidloff, also with NAST, and she is running the controls and helping out behind the scenes, but just wanted to acknowledge that her presence today and that she's helping out with this webinar. Usually Jeremy is with us, but he's on travel today and sends his best. I do want to thank everyone for tuning in this afternoon. I know it's a busy time of year, and for many of you, your state legislatures are probably in session and busy working on those as well, so I appreciate it. Before we begin today's online event, I just have a couple of housekeeping notices. For those of you who wish, the handouts, the PowerPoint presentation is available under the handouts section over on the right-hand side of your screen. So if you want to review those, they are there. We will also be recording this webinar, and it will be posted under the archives, webinar archives on the NAST website for your future reference. So I believe you just click on the conference and event tab. There's a drop-down menu that says archives, and you just go there, and it will be posted there as soon as we get it from the company. I do want to encourage everyone to be interactive in this session and that type in questions as they come up. So Emma, someone says they're having a difficulty with audio. I'm not sure if we need to release something or if you're hearing me. Maybe someone can put something into the question box to make sure that you can hear everything correctly. And make sure that you're not muted on your end as well. So why don't we just do a quick test run and make sure that everyone is here. We have quite a few people joining us today. So just quick add into the question box what state you are calling in from today. Just either the two-letter code that you use for zip codes, your state name, or what state you're in. So we have Illinois, Massachusetts, Michigan, New York, Utah, West Virginia, Maryland, another Michigan. Great, I see quite a few of you here. Rhode Island, another person from Utah. So Ohio, Pennsylvania, a couple of you from Pennsylvania, Oregon. So this is great. Thank you, everyone. It looks like audio is now back up and working. Alabama, Arizona, California, Delaware. Wonderful. So it gives our presenters just a little idea of where people are calling in from. So this is fabulous. So I want to, again, welcome you on behalf of NAST and our membership today. We have some special guests with us, and I want to quickly introduce them and then turn it over to the webinar because I'm just as excited as you are to hear what our panelists have to say. So joining us is Mr. Doug Robinson. He's the Executive Director of NASIO, which is the National Association for State Chief Information Officers. And joining him is Meredith Ward, who is a Senior Policy Analyst also with NASIO. NAST Executive Director Sean Snyder and I happened to attend a briefing earlier this year that they held here in Washington, D.C., and we knew right away that we wanted to bring this information to our members. So we are very excited that they've agreed to give us an overview of their research today. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Doug and to Meredith to take it away, and we will come back and take questions. And I actually have a couple of polling questions after their presentation. So stick around for that because we do want your input so that we can provide future programming to you here at NAST. So Doug, Meredith, over to you.
Kari, thank you very much, and I thank all the attendees this afternoon who came to listen to a little bit about state cybersecurity and what's going on with the state. So first, a little bit about NASIO. For those of you who may not be familiar with the association, let's say a blatant commercial message for the first 20 or 30 seconds. We are the National Association representing the state chief information officers of the states, territories, and the District of Columbia. We represent the executive branch, IT leadership only, in addition to the prime members being the state CIOs, very similar to NAST in terms of representing those state officials. We also have hundreds of others obviously involved in state IT that are part of the association. In addition, about 150 corporate members that are ex officio members. They're all the technology companies, solution providers that you know and love that serve the state government, particularly the public sector marketplace. So they're a big part of our community as well. We have a very straightforward agenda in terms of what we do as the association, obviously very similar to other nonprofit associations serving state officials, and that's really to serve as a resource for them to advocate on their behalf and provide meaningful education and networking experiences through our conferences and events. So that's what we do. I think most importantly right now we are celebrating our 50th anniversary. So yes, we are a legacy system here at NAST. We've been around since 1969. So anyway, with that, let's move into I'm going to provide some opening remarks about the overall general landscape in state IT today and highlighting the importance of cybersecurity and risk reduction. One of the things that we have to deal with the state CIO community is constant churn. You all have a number of state treasurers that are elected as well. All of our state CIOs are appointed, and there's lots of turnover and transition during gubernatorial transitions. So if you kind of visualize a heat map here with the terms of the 22 new governors we've had elected in November of 2018, we so far have 14 new CIO transitions, about to go to 15 next week. We have a new one coming on board April 1. So that is actually lower than we expected, lower than I predicted. We have a number of CIOs that have actually been incumbent CIOs that have been reappointed. Generally, when we have that many governors, new governors come in, we would have almost as many new state CIOs. So we have a little more stability in 2019 as we've seen in the past. One of their top priorities, in fact, their top priority, and has been consistently, even ones that have been in their position for a number of years, been cybersecurity and just the overall information security and kind of risk reduction landscape. So that's an important component of the state CIOs. And so we're going to focus on that topic today, but I thought I would at least talk a little bit about what's going on in the whole environment. One is clearly more emphasis on enterprise solutions, including cybersecurity, enterprise policies. We'll talk a little bit about, Meredith will actually cover some of the challenges around the workforce and the talent. That is clearly in crisis mode in the cybersecurity space in the public sector, certainly local, state, and federal, but acute at the state and local level. We are seeing an advance of the CIO as broker model, which is really more of a new evolving effort to have bring in more outsourcing and more managed services into the government space. And we've got a number of publications and reports on that you can certainly review, but we're seeing more movement and evolution. And again, the movement from the owner-operator model, which has been predominant for the last 4 decades. So that has implications on security because of the increasing consolidation and optimization of the environment that we're seeing. Again, increasing interest in digital government and digital services. Again, another security slant within that discussion as well about providing credentials and identity and access management, secure online transactions, and digital services. So it becomes an important component of the overarching cybersecurity discussion. We recently put out a white paper on artificial or augmented intelligence and robotic process automation, and we're seeing interest in that. In our last report, when asked what the most emerging and impactful technology would be over the next 3 to 5 years, our CIOs overwhelmingly said it's going to be this component of artificial and augmented intelligence, bringing those services to bear in state government. So that's an important activity that we're tracking. And then finally, just the evolution of the state IT organization. And some of you may be served by your state CIO organization. They provide obviously a wealth of services, a stack of services out of their service catalog. Almost all of our state CIO central organizations are 100% chargeback. So they're delivering services to a host of the executive branch. So again, they have to include cybersecurity in those discussions as they begin this move towards more harmonization. Cybersecurity becomes a major topic of consideration on that. So with that, let me move into an important top 10 discussion, and I'll just highlight one thing here. We do a forced ballot with our CIOs. By forced, I mean they have a selected forced choices, and we have forced them to do it. So we really urge them to complete this. So they vote on this every year. They do it at the end of the calendar year and prognosticate, in this case, 2019 priorities. So this is their personal view. We then aggregate all that to the national view of state CIOs, and you can see cybersecurity and risk management is in the #1 spot, and this is for the 6th consecutive year that it's been #1. It has been on the list since its inception in 2006, and so that's something that's very important to this community and to this association is continuing to promote and advocate for, again, reducing the risks and focusing on cybersecurity as a strong business discipline in the state. So we conduct a lot of research on that topic, obviously. So let me move on to the kind of the next set of data points around what the threats are, and then I'm going to kind of have Meredith talk a little bit about the survey and the data report. There is a whole constellation of cybersecurity threats, as you've certainly seen in your own organizations, perhaps in the press, that are exposed to the government sector particularly. One of the major challenges that we have is a consistent lack of organization around facing the threats that the states have, and increasingly magnitude of the threats are increasing each year, as well as the morphing. The threats are changing. They're becoming more sophisticated. There are new attack vectors coming from bad actors, whether it's criminal activities or increasing foreign nation states. We're seeing a lot of that. We've now seen the change from less of a data-centric or a way to attack data to much more of one of hacktivism and ransomware to disrupt the continuity of government. That's really troublesome. I think it's particularly troublesome for elected officials, those that have the public trust and are more visible, that we now have we have outside actors that are looking to disrupt government and disrupt the continuity of government, and that's concerning to us, in addition to just trying to steal data. So again, you can see the whole host of threats we have there. One of them is consistently not being better organized and not having more discipline around this. So we're seeing an increasing set of controls being put in place by many of the states and high adoption of standard frameworks, and that's really important. So one of the things that I'm going to end with is this report that we put out about 3 years ago on cyber disruption. And again, this highlights the importance of moving beyond simply what I'll call cyber incidents, which could be threats or the attempt to hack into systems and steal data. One where we have now groups like Anonymous, we have criminal groups in Russia and Estonia, China. We have groups that like the Chinese government that are infiltrating systems simply from an espionage capability. Many of them now are trying to actually disrupt government. So it's a much more higher level of an incident. And you've certainly seen this in the last couple of years with ransomware. We have some high-profile ransomware attacks, obviously designed to monetize or to steal data by holding data hostage, steal money, but they're really also designed to disrupt government, and that's even more concerning as we go forward about the capabilities that these bad actors have. So that's something we have to consider as we build the resources necessary to protect institutions. You have to look at they're becoming much more aggressive and more sophisticated in their approaches. So again, cyber disruption is something that's high on our list, and that's why we worked on this piece of effort more than 3 years ago. So, and let me end with one thing, which is obviously we always have to consider is, regardless of all the defenses, all the investments that states are making, from the endpoint all the way back to the desktop and the laptop, people are always involved, and they tend to be, as you know, the major threat is your internal employees. And then by that I don't mean malicious. We talk about the insider threat. There's certainly malicious insiders from employees to contractors, but more frequently what we find is simply errors. Most of these, if you look at the host of data thefts across the states in the last decade, almost all of them can go back to a lack of due diligence. Someone clicking on a link, on a malware, on a phishing attack, some type of email that came in that they shouldn't have accessed and they did, and it opens up a whole host of problems. So again, we're constantly faced with how to deal with the human factor, and really how to deal with Dave over in the corner. So that's something to consider as you look at your own organization, is how are your people being trained and educated, and are you're really making sure that they have the right tools to thwart any attempts, and they've been educated and made aware of again, the increasing sophistication of what we're seeing out there in the wild. So With that, I'm going to turn it over to Meredith for a kind of discussion of, we look at the state landscape, what they're really concerned about.
So thanks, Doug. So this is kind of why we're here today, right? To talk a little bit about cybersecurity. And for the longest time, you know, cybersecurity was really looked at as just an IT issue, and kind of, you know, relegated to the CIO's office, and the folks who had pocket protectors and all of that. But as we've kind of gone over a little bit today, cybersecurity definitely a team sport because of the business risk to the state. So again, the state business risk, financial risk, privacy and confidentiality, reputational and political risk, and we've all seen how this can impact state government. Again, cybersecurity is a team sport. I love the cartoon about Dave because I do think that humans can be the biggest risk, and they can also be the biggest asset when it comes to cybersecurity. So extremely important that everyone is on the same page and educated about the risk of cybersecurity. I want to talk a little bit about a study that we do every other year, the Deloitte NASCIO cybersecurity study, and it's on our website if anyone is curious, nascio.org, to see it in detail. So we're very lucky. In 2018, we had all 50 chief information security officers respond. In 95% of states, CISOs, as they're called, report to the state chief information officer. Many of you might be familiar with that role. They are in charge of cybersecurity for the state. So I want to get into just a little bit about this past year's survey and some of the things that the CISOs reported to us. So again, as we kind of talked about a little bit, ransomware, social engineering, phishing are the top cyber threats for state. You can see kind of their comparative 2018 and 2016, where we were. Most of those have increased at least a little bit. And I'm sure that there are examples in your states. What's one, Doug, that comes to your mind of a good one? Or maybe a not good one, yeah, depending on how you look at it.
Good one. Yeah, so let's take some time to step back a little bit about definitions. Obviously, ransomware has become increasingly more prevalent in the last couple of years, as, again, particularly criminal activities have stolen so much data that the price point per data set of the dark web has actually been declining. Which is obviously concerning to all of us, but they've really moved to more of a ransomware where they're using software to essentially hijack your system so they can lock it up using wonderful technology such as crypto locker, and then they can hold your data for ransom. Just 2 weeks ago, we had a county in Georgia that was held ransom and ended up actually paying $400,000 to recover all of their systems. This has been common in small jurisdictions and local governments, healthcare institutions, police departments, water utilities on the West Coast. So we're seeing this is really problematic. We're seeing more of this. Obviously, a lot of challenges around that for small jurisdictions. We've had a large urban area in the South that was brought to their knees by a large ransomware attack. We had a large Department of Transportation in a western state where their entire system was taken down by a ransomware attack, and they essentially were out of business for about 2 months. So these have become very debilitating. Ransomware, again, can be relatively well orchestrated and simple to do. Social engineering often comes along with ransomware, as certainly comes along with phishing attacks or deliberate attacks. There's various, as you probably read in the press or may be aware of, various things like spear phishing, which is a directed attack at specific individuals. There's now whaling. Whaling is an attempt to defraud someone by using powers of authority. So they might use an administrator, they might use an executive director, they might use a commissioner as a whaling attempt, use their credentials to actually defraud the government or get an internal employee to do that on their behalf. And so that's also been on the rise. I think what we see in the social engineering is really more sophisticated attempts with very well orchestrated attacks where they're using credentials or using terminology, they're using perhaps individuals' names within the organization to make it legit. Last year, we had several states that had a W-2 social engineering phishing attack. Again, well done. Targeted at certain states at the perfect time of year, the last week in January, they sent out an email to several thousand employees within several states saying, your electronic W-2 is now available, click here. Well, again, social engineering, motivation, folks were looking for that. They always knew that their W-2 would be made available electronically by their HR or finance folks. So they thought, well, 7 to 10 days early, that's great for me. I'd like to get my W-2. And of course, it was a well-orchestrated attack. Fortunately for the states, because they've done through some training on phishing, very few people fell for that. The ones that did, they were able to recover, but they were asking for folks' credentials. They were asking for their email address, their social security number, and once they did that, they captured that data. And again, fortunately, many of those folks were not compromised. The state was able to intervene, but they also did it in multiple states simultaneously. So these are the types of things we're seeing, and then I think they will continue to have, where we've got all these variants of these things that will continue to test. They have 24 hours a day, 7 days a week to come up with these schemes. And so it's, again, rests upon us and state government to be able to thwart these by using the right set of tools, but also making our employees and our contractors that are working for the state very aware of the increasing sophistication of these attempts and how well they are developed. Because that email, the ones that I saw, looked exactly like they came from state government internally. So that's a problem.
So what do you think, Doug, on ransomware? Do you pay or you don't pay?
You don't pay.
Right.
What you do is you back up.
Right.
You have backup. You do backup.
Recover.
You do backup so you can recover.
Well, so we'll continue a little bit in how states are kind of being affected. Obviously, web applications, malicious code. Down here, also electronic attacks or hackers. Physical attacks, that's interesting. Stolen computer systems or other state-owned items. So Doug, talk a little bit about malicious code. That's something that I feel like a few years ago we heard a whole lot about, and now we've almost moved on to not hearing as much about that in the news, but it still does happen. Let's talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think there's, again, I think the development of antivirus packages has been pretty extraordinary, and particularly because of the constant evolution of the files, the data files that are being developed to thwart these attempts. So now we have zero-day attacks, and so those are attacks that are designed to take place the day an application is released, when they immediately look for vulnerabilities. So the bad actors are looking for vulnerabilities in the new code, and so there's no way that you can actually thwart those if they get in there fast enough. So the web applications, the strength and rigorous testing is really important, making sure that live code is not put out there without extensive testing and security review. And there's many states that have now policies where there has to be a third-party review, or at least the CIO office has to have a total review of the code base before it's released. And so we're seeing, less vulnerabilities in some of those, but I think from a legacy standpoint, we know that there's still a lot of vulnerabilities in software on the web, but also we're seeing that from the standpoint of kind of maybe perhaps a reduction in the virus side, but more potential in the malware side, spyware, key logging. Again, those generally, those payloads come through phishing attacks. They come through email for the most part. They can be injected through a website, but we're seeing a lot of folks that actually those things become more prevalent within state agencies because those payloads come through emails. That's why it's important to have a high degree of training. So what we've seen is states that have deployed enterprise-wide phishing exercises and also subscribed to a new class of software that is cloud-based, that provides the capabilities for state CIO offices to do phishing exercises and to actually mimic those and to test employees on a regular basis. And some of them now it's required as part of kind of their HR pieces that they do the regular testing. So again, we're going to see more, I think, in the ransomware and perhaps in the hacktivism area in the future.
So as we've told you about all these, sure, go ahead, Kari.
Thanks. Let me interrupt for a moment because I think I just got phished right now. Did you guys plan this? because I just got an email from Joseph P. McNamara at house.virginia.gov with an attachment that says voicemail 3 seconds. And there's no one by this name on our webinar right now. So I'm just wondering if you set this up, because I plan to delete it. Emma, did you get it?
Well,
Yeah, we're not that good, Kari, but we should take credit for it.
Yeah, I would definitely hover over the email and make sure that that's actually the email that it came from, because that's generally the case. So they're masking the actual originating email. So sometimes you'll see it as a .com, because the .gov address is highly secure.
So we should advertise that, Kari, that we have real life demonstrations in our webinars. So we've told you about all these kind of terrible things that are happening, could happen, but there is some good news. Cybersecurity maturity is improving. More risk-based strategies are kind of coming into play. So I know this is a really huge graphic, but a couple things that I want to draw your attention to. The first one, all states, but every state but 2 has developed cybersecurity awareness training for workers and contractors. So I'm sure that that's something you all have come into contact with. That's not required. I think in a little over half of the states that's actually required. It's usually once a year, usually an online thing. So that's something that hopefully is familiar to most of you. The other thing, kind of halfway down the middle, created a culture of information security. This one is huge. Goes back to the cybersecurity as a team sport. Like I said, this is not something that's just the CIO's responsibility, and the CIO or the CISO can take care of everything with cybersecurity. It's a whole of state effort. And one thing again that we found is it is becoming a little bit more baked into the fabric and the recipe of states. And so the last one that I'll draw your attention to is obtain cyber insurance. So now we have about 42 states that have obtained cyber insurance. We get a lot of questions about this, and I think a lot of people think that, again, cyber insurance might be a silver bullet, but it is one component in the recipe of cyber security. And like I said, only under half of states have cybersecurity insurance, so this is not something that, again, states are saying, okay, we're going to get cyber insurance and we're good. We got this, and we don't have to worry about it again.
So if you look at this from your organization, just to simplify, you've got about 10 metrics here that we use and have for a number of years longitudinally, and then added a couple recently. But if you look at those top ones, those are ones that basically describe an increasing maturity. So it's kind of it's not a formalized capability maturity model, but it's, again, our attempt to capture the maturity over time and the advances. We wanted to actually see our states moving the ball on this, and certainly if you look at things like a strategic plan, the most important element up there is, do you have a roadmap? Have you adopted a framework? For many of you, this may be new terminology, but this cybersecurity framework is publicly available. It's what most of the states are using today from the CIO office, but there's others as well. There's national standards. One that's very important is the CIS, Center for Internet Security, 20 critical controls. So they've identified 20 critical security controls, which if implemented will drastically reduce your risk. And actually 5 or 6 of those will reduce your risk by 80–90% just by implementing some of those. So simple things like controlling administrator access. So you really want to have a minimal number of administrators that have access to various systems. That's not been the case in many organizations. And I think those administrative rights have been given out way too freely. And so they find that that's one of the major things. Obviously, one that's always on the list is passwords. So, expiring passwords, controlling passwords, strong password construction, using technology to make sure that your users are in fact constructing strong passwords and not reusing them, and that they do expire, can have a dramatic impact on your security posture. So there are simple cyber hygiene things that all organizations can do, large or small, that can have a significant impact on reducing risks to your organization.
So while there's a little bit of good news, and we know that states are maturing, obviously persistent challenges, budget, talent, and sophistication of threats have been the top challenges every year that we've done the survey. And as you can see, since 2010, this was the 5th iteration of that. So we'll get into those just a little bit more specifically. A budget challenge. It's very hard to really total up what states are exactly spending on cybersecurity. Some states do have a budget line item, but to really add up what every agency might be spending, that's definitely a challenge. But this gives, I think, a good picture, and this is just, again, the enterprise IT budget that's allocated to cybersecurity. And I think that, again, we asked the specific, do you have a budget line item in 2018, something that we hadn't done before, and we parsed out the percentages. You can see there a little bit. Anything to say on that, Doug, about budgeting?
No, there's no magic elixir here. We talk about funding commensurate with the risk, and clearly, if you look at the data we've had for the last iterations of our first collection of data around this topic, has been relatively consistent, around 2% of the total IT spend in the state. So somewhat disappointing. If you look at the comparison to the federal government spend this year on cybersecurity is 16% on average of their total total IT budget for the federal government, about $83 billion. If you look at the private sector, particularly banking, finance, insurance, those service and highly intensive paper organizations like state government, they're generally in the 5% or greater, sometimes 8 to 10%, particularly banking institutions, financial institutions, which are at significant risk. So they are spending what they believe is commensurate to the external and internal risks. States have not been able to get those kind of dollars. So again, examine your own organization, your treasurer's office. What is your, if you know, what is your total spend every year around technology? What is your parts of that in terms of the pieces and parts in terms of security? Is it 2%? Generally, we find that's about 2% for security. And we've seen some increases, but not enough movement over the last 4 to 8 years. Not enough that we'd like. I think there's more attempt now to get direct funding. We've advocated for that. There's also an attempt to look at the enterprise availability of resources, noting that the states may be spending more, but it's not collected at an enterprise level. So having more visibility into what is actually being expended in the security space is what some states are focused on today, so they can leverage the economies of scale. And that's something that's important as well for maximizing your investments in security products and solutions, which can get quite expensive.
So the last thing that we'll cover on the cyber survey, this year, one thing that we wanted to do a little bit differently is that we really wanted to issue some calls to action for states. And so we've named them bold plays for change. And so again, the first one, what we've been talking about, advocate for dedicated cyber program funding. That is, making a line item for cyber, and also seeking funding from federal agencies and other sources. And then, having CISOs be an enabler of innovation, not a barrier. A lot of times when I ask, do you know your CISO? Some people say yes, and their doctor no, that we can't do X, Y, or Z because of cybersecurity constraints or whatever. So we're really encouraging CISOs to actively participate in all innovation agendas and things like that for states, and really to be involved in every aspect, because cybersecurity is involved in just about everything that a state does. And once again, it's a team sport. Everybody has to be on the same page. And then finally, talking about some of the workforce issues and other things like that, teaming up with the private sector and higher education. I don't remember if there was anyone from Georgia on the webinar or not, but if y'all are interested, something that was really cool that opened last year, the Georgia Cyber Center, partnering again with higher education, the private sector, bringing all of that together, and really the first of its kind in this country. States kind of have realized that they can't really do it alone, and so we've seen creative approaches from CISO as a service, or bringing a private sector person in to serve as a state CISO for a year or two, kind of as a fellowship or something like that. even to just developing pipelines of talent through local universities, that states are really having to team with the private sector in higher education. So I want to kind of go into, we talked about this earlier, how CIOs plan to deliver or obtain services in the future, and Doug's going to talk a little bit about this, but the face of how things are going to be and are being done in the state, it's really changing, and it will continue to change. So we've done a lot of, on this, Doug, so talk about CIO as broker and what you see in the future.
Yeah, thanks, Meredith. So these evolving business models, I included this because this has implications for the security space and, again, the overall business risk, which has kind of been elevated as the highest priority for CIOs. You look at their agenda over the next couple of years, it's really focused on addressing the risks in a variety of ways in the state government executive branch. So not only cyber risk, but risks of completing projects. You know, the project failure rate continues to get discussed. Although, again, if you look at the holistic catalog of what's going on in the states, it's relatively rare to see these large failures, but do get lots of press. Part of these things is recognizing that they're given the capital constraints, meaning the lack of capital dollars to advance new things in state government, that the CIOs are looking for different approaches and more effective approaches. They all aspire to have kind of a modern organization, and that move is going to be from what we have called the owner-operator model, where the CIO organization or the agencies owned all the hardware and the software, and they operated it all on-premise, meaning on the state government campus in their buildings, is clearly changing. And we see this. We've been tracking this for years, and you see the data here where you see the areas of managed services and outsourcing expanding. Those are areas where they're using either a managed service, and in some cases it would be a managed cybersecurity service. We have a number of states that have those capabilities where they've contracted with a third party to provide managed security services by an outside vendor. And they realize that's the only way they can be successful given the limited resources and the talent crisis that they're having. They cannot acquire the competencies and disciplines in cybersecurity professionals at the compensation rate. That's, you know, the major challenge they have. 96% of them report that that's a major barrier to getting talent in, is the compensation, given the marketplace and how hot it is in the cybersecurity space. So the forces of change, as we like to call them, around, you know, the talent issues, the retirement issues, the business models, the adoption of cloud services, all of these are pressuring state CIOs and states in general to make different decisions. You can see that lined up in this table where they're moving to those things. So what are they not doing? Well, if you look at the inverse of this table 10 years ago, the CIOs would have told you what they were going to do is build new data centers, they were going to expand their data centers, and they were going to hire more IT staff. Those are at the bottom of the list today. They're not expanding their data centers. No one's building a new data center. If anything, they're constraining them. They've got excess capacity. They're looking for partners. They're looking for hosting opportunities. They're looking for co-location. They're bringing in local governments and higher education institutions into their data center. So this is all going to have an impact on future investments, future business models, public-private collaboration, these hybrid models. So in the future, we certainly see states will be using more of these hybrid models. They're not going to be hiring more state IT staff. They're going to be using more supplemental staffing, and they're going to be using more of these capabilities. And certainly cloud is going to impact that. The adoption of cloud services has an impact on the legacy environment that states have. So that, again, will be another area where security will be important and paramount, is what they're doing with securing their cloud applications and cloud services. So again, you've heard the as a service models perhaps, and we see that across the board. X as a service, all the states moving to these new capabilities. You need a new financial management or ERP. That is not going to be something that you're going to acquire and buy hardware and software and put it on premise in a state building anymore. It's going to be something you subscribe to in the cloud, and you take advantage of that. One of the, I think, artifacts of that, I think an excellent example is something that we've certainly found in the last couple of years that most audiences are surprised about, is you think about the mainframe computers or a mainframe in a state kind of being the iconic operation of a state CIO. That's generally what they would do. A major agency or the state's organization would operate the mainframe. They would provide those cycles of mainframe services and charge back to the agencies. What you can see from this data, that is movement to, we're not going to own mainframes anymore. We're going to actually let mainframe be a service someplace else. We now have 10 states where the mainframe is no longer in their state capital. We have several that have abandoned them and several where they've moved it over to a third party off-premise. So their mainframe is not in their state capital. It may be in Boulder, Colorado, and running the same services. So I think if you look at the data from our last report, you'll see that this is an area that has increasingly more attention. We have 60-some% of our CIOs say they're going to move in that direction or they plan to move. And again, I think the ones that are hesitant are the ones that have still large legacy applications and are yet to make that decision. But for cost efficiency and for continued life cycle modernization and refreshment, this is really, in some cases, the only option that states are going to have is to move in this direction. So that's something to keep an eye on. And we talked a little bit about the emerging trends, so I thought I would bring this up. And this is one that we're certainly, again, tracking and also writing about. Put out a report several months ago about artificial intelligence and robotic process. In the areas particularly that you all might be interested in financial transactions and accounting and others, we're seeing states adopt robotic process automation. Those are simply bots. Those are automated scripts that are able to do the work, usually menial, highly manual intensive work. Bots can replace a lot of that with a high degree of accuracy and run 24 hours a day. And so we've seen states adopt that. Again, about a quarter of the states are doing something in this space. We're going to see higher adoption of artificial or augmented intelligence. AI is already being used in a number of states in cybersecurity because if you look at the magnitude, the volume, and the frequency of these threats, over time, humans cannot possibly put their eyeballs on enough of this data to detect that. So you need algorithms. You need machine learning that can learn on the fly about these threats and that can basically build capabilities by using artificial intelligence to be your kind of first wall, so to speak, to detect these inbound threats and build patterns over time. And that, again, that machine learning will help and pass that information on, pass those parameters on to others. So we're seeing, again, high degree of interest around artificial intelligence in the cybersecurity space. And I think it'll grow in other areas of government. And we're going to see that as states begin to learn how these algorithms can take the place of some of these very menial or very complicated tasks that can be done by AI. So we're excited to kind of monitor that. And there's a lot of considerations. You'll see lots around the concern about AI and job replacement, ethical concerns around artificial intelligence, no human intervention making sophisticated, perhaps application or entitlement decisions for citizens. I think, again, those are all going to be built with business rules that have scripts involved that have been used for decades. We're simply now automating those. We'll see how efficient they become, and I think we'll have to work through some of those issues over time. We have a set of final points around just consideration, like looking forward in this space in cybersecurity. If you look at kind of what I call the patterns of success from a number of states that are doing this well, what have they learned? What are they working on? And you can see some of those. We've articulated some of those here. So I'll let Meredith highlight just a few of these.
So I think, once again, coming back to the thing that maybe we've said the most during the webinar, or the NASTcast. I think that's really cute, by the way. NASTio can't really. We don't have anything that we really rhyme with, so I'm jealous. But again, these kind of all revolve around the cybersecurity being a team sport. It focuses on making decisions based on the business risk and protecting things within the state. We talked a lot about training, and that is so incredibly important. If you have Dave in one corner and you have all the threats in another corner, training and awareness is one of the most important things that states can do. And again, with just over half having cybersecurity training required, be the first in your state who said, it's not required, but I want to take this training every single year. You'll surprise and delight your CISO if you do that. And again, the workforce issue. Everyone really has to be on board with this, advocating for cybersecurity skills. We didn't talk as much about this in the section about the study, but you know, folks in the private sector, if someone graduates and they want to be a CISO, they can go get hired in the private sector and just make bukus more money than they can working for state or federal government, and we all know that. So like I said, states are getting creative in how they're approaching this, and support is needed. It is one of the only, cybersecurity jobs is one of the only functions where there's consistent negative unemployment rates. So more jobs than there are people to fill them. We talked a lot about emerging trends. This is very interesting, and we have our very own emerging trends guru in the room as well, Amy Glasscock. She's the one who's written a lot of these papers on AI and IoT and things like that. The final one, crisis communication. This is something that's very near and dear to my heart. A lot of times when we talk about tech and cybersecurity, we just focus on the technical aspects and not the so-called soft skills. And I hate calling them soft skills, but I didn't make it up. I just have to use it. So extremely important that if cybersecurity really is going to be a team sport, that the folks who are kind of in the know about what's happening have to be able to communicate that to the legislature, to other members in the executive branch, and to everyone within the state. So going forward, Doug, what are some?
Let me go back.
Oh, we're going to go back.
Well, I'm going to go back and double down on crisis communication.
Yep.
We started crisis communication training for our CIOs several years ago, bringing in experts to actually talk about that. So if you have not considered this in the Treasurer's Office, if you don't have a crisis communications checklist, and you may have one already, but you haven't considered that the crisis could be the loss of data, a data breach, the ransomware attack, hacktivism from civil disobedience. All these things are vulnerabilities, and all of them are real today, and all of them happen every day. So if you do not have a crisis communications checklist, if you don't have a point of contact, if you don't have a clear and compelling message that you can have a story to tell when you have an event, you will be toast in the press. So when you have a data breach, you don't want to say, we don't have any comments at this time, because the press and the media will make up comments, particularly if there's a known loss of data. And so I think the states, particularly state leaders and governors and others, have learned the hard way that they're very comfortable speaking about the latest flood or the tornado or some man-made or natural disaster because they have experience in that space. Emergency management has their own framework. They've done it in the past, but we've seen certainly recently that the elected leaders and even those in the industry are not well prepped on having to describe the loss of data and cyber incidents. So again, in addition to communications piece, this is the communication that should be taking place internally in terms of the possibility of an event. What would be your response? And so there's communications checklists. There's the consulting firms that actually focus and have expertise on crisis communication. That's their job, and there are many of those in the country that will help craft that. So I think I would urge you all as elected officials to have these conversations. We've held many sessions with our state CIOs dedicated to crisis communication. And if you look at our latest survey on attributes and skills, the critical success factors for state CIOs, they rank communication as number one. And so they know that this is critically important to be able to, again, we're talking about business risk to a state. And so they cannot fumble and stumble their way through a press conference trying to describe an event. They need to be very well prepared and need to have lots of evidence. So again, I would urge you all to consider that as well, because I think other state leaders have learned lessons the hard way when they were not prepared.
And these days, you're just as likely almost to be, to have a cyber incident that you'll have to deal with, just like any other, as Doug said, traditional crisis. In state government, that's just kind of the world we live in. We say it's not if you've been attacked or breached, it's when. So we want to leave you guys with some questions, call to action for state leaders. again, we talk a lot about culture of information security. Cybersecurity is a team sport. Do you feel that in your state? And if you don't, talk with your CIO and your CISO and make sure that you're in communication with them. From the other questions here, Doug, or the call to actions, what's one or two that you really think are really important to highlight here?
Well, I would certainly look at the investment in technology, and again, depending on your status within the state in terms of elected or appointed treasurer or your office, whether they have interaction with the CIO office or whether you all are totally independent. One of the things to look at is, again, with the sophistication of threats, states are having to invest in additional technology such as continuous diagnostics and mitigation, things like a very strong endpoint detection. You may have to invest in DLP or data loss prevention, where you have stateful inspection of inbound, particularly outbound email. Basically, do you know where your email is going and what's attached to your email? Is there sensitive information? Is there citizen information, taxpayer information that could be inadvertently attached to an email? The advanced cyber analytics, huge databases that are monitoring on a regular basis. These are all the things that state CIO organizations are investing in at the enterprise level. So you've got to have to look again, examine what you're doing in terms of your own environment. Do you have the capability and the financial wherewithal to invest in these technologies, because they increasingly are requiring more investments to keep up with the level of threat. So that's something to really look at.
So I know here are our email addresses, and of course, Kari can also get in touch with us if anyone has questions, and that's kind of it for us, but I know that Kari has a couple of maybe questions or fun things. So thanks, Kari, for having us.
Thank you, Meredith. Thank you, Doug. I appreciate it. Emma, if you want to put up the next slide, but in the meantime, Kathy Blumenthal wants to know, where can she get her state data for the reports that you've been talking about? Can you just give a shout out for your URL and where folks can go?
So that's a good question, Kathy. So the data that CISOs put in, that is, we make that available only to state CIOs and CISOs. So we don't make that public. All the data within the study is aggregated, but if you're curious, you could always reach out to your CISO and say, hey, I heard about this. I wonder how our state's doing, and maybe he or she might share it.
There you go. It's a great challenge. We had Deb Snyder, who's the in New York State, the CISO in New York State was at our legislative conference in February. Yeah. And her challenge to everyone was, have a cup of coffee with your CIO and your chief security officer. Get to know them now. So Kathy, that's a great challenge for you to go out and meet your information officer and get this data for your state. But it is in aggregate, as Meredith just mentioned. It is on their website, nascio.org, and I use it a lot, so I recommend it. So, someone else got an email from the same one that I did, so there was definitely a phishing attack going on, so that's interesting. Craig Cannon from Georgia is on. They have cybersecurity insurance in their state. He was also part of the new Cyber Tech Center that is down in Augusta, Georgia. Craig, I'd like to talk to you about that at some point. I think it's something that we'll want to share with other treasurers in other states. You've been on my short list to contact about that. Please,
Georgia, Kari, Georgia is actually a leader in cyber insurance with their model. They actually did a laddered model. Unique in Georgia is that they included the elected officials. They included more organizations than the executive branch. So they decided to take a very broad approach. Most states, it's either within the executive branch only or within certain agencies. Georgia's has the most comprehensive liability coverage and very sophisticated solicitation to get to that space. So we always point them as being one of the market leaders in that cyberspace.
Well, wonderful. We'll take that into consideration, something we'll want to talk about ourselves. For those of you who are still on the line, and we still have a number of you, if you could just look at the slide in front of you and just throw into the box there either the text or just the number of what is it that is a priority for your state when it comes to the
I'm not sure. Emma, you can probably take mouse control back.
So if you could just throw in there.
Sorry, not sure what happened there.
That's okay. So any thoughts from people still on the line? You can either just throw in number 1 through 6, but what are priorities in your state? I see number 1. 162-111 is getting a lot of shout outs for risk and security. Oh, everyone's coming in. 1 and 2 collectively. This is great. We will make sure that we follow up on those issues. Okay. Emma, you want to go to the next screen? We're going to change the question just a moment for, and if you could throw that in as well. Again, in your states, what is the priorities when it comes to applications and tools? So we have some new options here. Some are holdovers, but is it cloud solutions, security enhancements, the legacy systems? Are you planning on modernization or renovation, business intelligence, identity and access management, collaboration, data management, disaster recovery, something that folks were just talking about? What is your state looking at here? 1, 2, and 3. 5 and 8. 1, 2, and great. This is really helpful, everyone. Thank you. We'll go back and correlate this, and then we plan to put a series together so that we can provide better training for all of you. So we did get a couple of questions here while people are logging in. Let's see, let me get to the question here, and I know we're getting close to the top of the hour. So one of the questions from Marianne says, are you finding that most states, Meredith and Doug, this is for you, are you finding that most states are adopting similar or the same NIST standards, or is there a great disparity in the IT security design?
Great question. I'm happy that we were talking about NIST here. I wasn't sure that that was going to be brought up, but there's actually a question about that in our survey. But Doug, I see you kind of shaking your head a little bit. So yeah.
I think the states that were early adopters of a security architecture, and then some go back to 2002, 2005, and that time frame, they began with the ISO standards, since NIST did not have the SB 800 series out. But today, I think states are focused on NIST special publication, obviously 800 on security, which is embodied in the framework. The framework is more expansive. So for ease of mapping, and I think for states to use that, if you look at our data, 90+% of the states, when we say national framework for cybersecurity, you know, we generically are describing the NIST cybersecurity framework. So that's the predominant. They're not all eating it hook, line, and sinker, right? There are components of that in terms of the functions that they're more advanced than others. Some are clearly using, you know, parts of ISO. They're also using, I said, they're perhaps for simplicity and adoption using the 20 critical controls from CIS, which are also, again, cross-referenced. So the framework cross-references a lot of existing standards, and we actually promote that in our work around data classification. So under the protection function in the framework, there is a whole section on data classification and data, how to protect your data. I think from an organization like you all, that would be critically important, is adopting components of that. So if you're doing a risk-based strategy, you might focus on that as opposed to something else. Perhaps actually you don't have as much hardware in your environment. You know, somebody else may be running it, but you may have lots of network connections to various services. So again, you'd want to make sure that you're using encrypted services for network transport. So I think it's what we advertise and really advise is that you focus on a risk-based strategy, and you simply don't spread that peanut butter over the white bread evenly. You actually focus on your risks, and data in public sector organizations is the predominant, obviously, risk. And so protect your data, and you can do that by classifying it, which can be an arduous task. It's not easy to do, but we have a white paper out describing why data classification is an important step.
Great. Lorraine, if you're still on, and everyone else, if you're looking for the slides, they're over on under the handouts section on the right-hand side of your screen. And also, if you just want to shoot Emma or I an email, we can make sure that we get those to you as well. But a couple of people were asking where the handouts are. So Craig, I'm going to use your last question as sort of a jumping off point. He's asking about millennials and how this might impact cybersecurity towards cloud services, Internet of Things, and AI. So I'm actually going to take this one, Doug and Meredith, myself, and give a shout out for our conference, the Treasury Management Training Symposium, which is in May in Providence, Rhode Island. And we actually have 2 or 3 sessions, Craig, exactly on this topic. And so I would encourage everyone, invite everyone who's on the phone this afternoon to come to that conference and get one-on-one training with panels of experts in these areas on fraud and security, artificial intelligence, the Internet of Things, on generational activities, both in investing and in security. So we've got a couple of panels talking directly about that. So Craig, I hope to see you in Rhode Island in May for more advanced conversation on this. And the last thing before we sign off here, because it is the top of the hour and I want to respect everyone's time, is that Doug and Meredith, I'd love to invite you back. One of the things that NAST is standing up is a caucus, we're calling it, for the public information officers, or people who go by a similar title within the Treasury offices. And I would love to do a session just for them on this crisis communications and that checklist that you talked about. I think everyone would be interested in hearing more about that. So I'll put the challenge out there now so that we can get folks together in the near future to have that conversation. And I'd like to hear more about Georgia, what you all are doing with your cybersecurity insurance, because I've heard from a couple other people that they want more information on this as well. So this will really help guide us in future programming that we deliver to you from NAST. You know, if I could give a virtual handshake and clapping for Doug and Meredith, please know that we appreciate your time and all the research and the survey work that you do with your members that impact our members. And again, let me convey the same challenge that the CISO from New York State gave to our members. She said, have a cup of coffee now with your chief information officer, your chief security officer, who may not, more than likely is, you know, not in your chain of command, but elsewhere within the state government agency, but get to know that person now before these hits happen. Keep in mind, if you did get that phishing attack from Virginia, do not open it. We're not sure what that is, but it looks like a few of us got it. So with that, we're going to close out this webinar. It will be available on our website under the webinar archive. Thank you, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day.